A turbocharged propeller claws at hot, wet air over northern Laos. A white cross of vapor scribbled across jungle ridgelines as steep as castle walls. The pilot's shirt sticks to his back. The altimeter jitters. In the cabin, sacks of rice are tied with hemp rope beside crates of antibiotics, radio batteries, and a bundle of children's sandals, because in this war the runway might be a village footpath, and the passengers might be a family fleeing a firefight they didn't start. The airplane wears a civilian paint scheme, but the flight plan is not in any travel agency's catalog. Its tail number belongs to a company that doesn't advertise. The invoices are clean, the mission is not. Air America, an airline that pretended to be ordinary so it could do the extraordinary, threads another valley at treetop height, invisible to anyone who isn't looking for it, and essential to everyone who is. The story begins before the name, when the Second World War had barely cooled and the long twilight of empires began. In China, Claire Chennault, the hard-nosed architect of the Flying Tigers, partnered with diplomat Whiting Willour to build a civilian carrier called Civil Air Transport, CAT. It hauled mail, people, and hope in a region where airstrips were just bleached rectangles scratched into mountains. When Mao's revolution upended the map in 1949, CAT evacuated refugees and ferried nationalist remnants to Taiwan. Someone in Washington noticed that a private airline, flying innocently painted aircraft, could go places military planes could not without triggering headlines or treaties. Through a Delaware shell and a handful of carefully washed dollars, the Central Intelligence Agency acquired the airline in 1950. CAT kept flying, and the CIA discovered that a proprietary company was a Swiss Army knife in a world prowled by wolves. In Southeast Asia, France was fighting to hold Indochina and losing. Later, the United States would inherit the problem and rename it policy, but in the 1950s, the game was cover and influence. CAT pilots flew hazardous cargoes to remote strips, delivered agents who disappeared into forests, and practiced the martial art of plausibly deniable logistics. In 1959, as the conflict widened and the mission hardened, the brand changed. The logo on the hangar wall read Air America, and with a new name came an old promise. We will go where we're told, without telling anyone where we are going. To understand why an airline became a weapon, imagine Laos, a landlocked country that diplomats in Geneva declared neutral in 1962, and reality declared strategic. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, the braided network of roads, paths, and footbridges that fed North Vietnamese forces in South Vietnam, ran like veins through the eastern Laotian jungle. Washington wanted the arteries pinched. A clandestine war blossomed behind the curtain of neutrality, run from embassies and safe houses, tracked on greased pencil maps, fought by local allies who knew every limestone ridge by memory and prayer. General Vang Pao, a Hmong officer who had learned to read the weather from mountain shadows, partnered with American case officers to raise a tribal army. Guns and rice moved by air, wounded and widows moved by air. The war itself moved by air because roads were few, mines were many, and time was everything. Air America became the circulatory system of that hidden conflict. Its pilots learned the location and nickname of every Lima site, though secret airstrips bulldozed into shivering ridgelines. LS-20A at Long Tieng, the beating heart of the CIA's Laotian enterprise. LS-36, LS-98, LS-272, coordinates recited like liturgy. Some strips were carved with just enough length for a short takeoff and landing machine, Helio Courier or Pilatus Porter, to bounce, break, and stop before the drop-off where clouds grew from the valley floor. Others could take a twin, the SAP-46, Commando with its bulldog stance, the SAP-47, a DC-3 in war paint. Later, the muscular C-123, provider that clawed over ridges with a cargo deck full of barrels and secrets. Helicopters multiplied like dragonflies, Bell 204s and 205s, Hueys by another name, hovering over ledges, lowering slings to snatch refugees, special guerrilla units, radios, and sometimes a pig that squealed indignantly as it rocketed skyward toward safety. A typical day did not exist, but the logbooks rhyme. A dawn flight carries rice to a Hmong village whose fields are pocked by bomb craters. The pilot sidesteps towering cumulus and a hilltop monastery. At the strip, really a trapezoid of dirt. The airplane lands uphill, dribbles to a halt, and kicks up a rooster tail of grit. Children swarm, but the crew chief, in a sweat-darkened boonie hat, motions them back so the blades stop first and the ramp can come down. The village elder signs a receipt for sacks of grain with a thumbprint because bureaucracy is the only thing the war shares with peace. Then the pilot lifts into air already boiling with heat, noses toward another ridge where a case officer with a cheap cigarette needs to survey a unit that fought all night, darting between trees and muzzle flashes. Midday, a helicopter scrabbles its skids onto a ledge barely wide enough for a billiard table and takes on 3 wounded men whose blood smells like iron and rain. Late afternoon, a C-123 dumps bundled drums of aviation fuel by parachute for a forward sight that refuels the very helicopter that will at dusk extract a stranded crew because the plane they were riding took fire and could not climb. In between, there is paperwork, radio chatter, and jokes told with tired eyes. In between, there is the drumming rhythm of engines that keep a shadow war alive. Pilots came from everywhere. Ex-military flyers who missed the sky, young men seduced by adventure, veterans of bush strips in Alaska and Africa who understood that a runway is an invitation and a dare. They learned new verbs. To sheep-dip was to strip a pilot of military identity, provide civilian clothes, and issue a contract that said nothing about who paid the bills. To kick a load was to shove cargo out the back when landing was impossible. To go black was to switch off transponders and fly under the radar, literally and figuratively. They learned new rules. The first was don't die. The second was don't make it obvious who you work for. The third was get the job done. In Long Tieng, where the runway slid like a zipper between limestone teeth, the pilots joked that the crosswind lived there permanently and only came home to sleep. They measured time not in hours but in missions. 10 hops today, 12 if the weather let them, and every hop could clatter into gunfire from a tree line that looked empty 5 seconds before. The CIA's reasons for using an airline were practical and political. A C-130 in U.S. markings, landing at a neutral nation's secret airbase would make noise that no muffler could mute. A twin-engine transport with a civilian tail number could pass under the same treaties like a shadow slipping under a door. Air America accepted government contracts written to look like commercial freight bills. The planes were registered in friendly countries. The crews were hired as civilians and briefed as if they were in uniform. When a mission went well, the client called it commerce. When one went badly, the sponsor could feign surprise. Statecraft has always prized deniability. Aviation simply gave it wings. Alongside aerial logistics came rescue. Downed American pilots in Laos and North Vietnam sometimes found themselves alone in green cathedrals where the floor moved and the ceiling rained. Combat search and rescue was mostly a U.S. Air Force realm, but Air America was often first on scene or last to leave because their pilots knew the folds of the land and the temperament of the weather, and because their chain of command ran through an embassy phone that never stopped ringing. An Air America helicopter might orbit as forward air controllers, Ravens, flying single-engine Cessnas with white scarves and a mapboard littered with grease pencil notes, marked enemy positions with smoke rockets. The Hueys spiraled down, flared, and the crew chief leaned out with a carabiner and a length of nylon that had saved more lives than sermons. Sometimes they made it out on the first try. Sometimes they came back again and again, dodging tracer fire that stitched red threads through the dusk. A pilot who had been shot down might climb onto the skid of a hovering helicopter because the slope was too steep to land. A crew might reach down and drag him into the cabin while the rotor tips whipped air into sawdust. It was not chivalry, it was a compact. We will come for you because we hope someone will come for us. The most controversial cargo in Air America's history was not people or guns or fuel, but a rumor that stuck like burrs to a flight suit: opium. In Laos, the Hmong and other highland communities had grown poppies for centuries, a crop that fit bad soil and high altitudes, a commodity portable in a world where wealth had to be carried on the back. Critics allege that Air America tolerated or even facilitated the opium trade, that sacks of rice concealed sacks of paste, that friendly militias financed themselves with narcotics, and that the airline looked away. Defenders answer that corporate policy forbade transporting opium, that pilots were fired when caught, that the company carried people and food and medicine and occasionally a family's dowry that turned out to be more problematic than spices. The truth is tangled. In a secret war with flexible allies, control frayed. A helicopter that lifts a wounded fighter will sometimes also lift what the family shoves aboard, and sometimes that is a bundle of plants no one wants to examine closely. The record shows bans written, memos circulated, licenses monitored, infractions punished. The record also shows the messy physics of a clandestine coalition. When you build an army out of tribes, you inherit their economies. Air America's pilots learned to live inside that ambiguity, and later, after the war, they learned to live with arguments about what they had done and why. Technically, the flying itself was an art. A Helio Courier could lift like a lark, using high lift devices to hop off strips shorter than a football field. A Pilatus Porter, angular and stubborn, clawed into the updrafts that rose off sunstruck rock, then dropped into bowls where the air swirled backward. The C-123, big-shouldered and blunt-nosed, absorbed punishment and returned the favor with reliability. Helicopters were temperamental saviors. Their rotors bit thick air and demanded finesse. Monsoons rearranged the sky twice a year, turning visibility into soup and dirt strips into clay. Mountain winds flowed like water, pooling on the lee side of ridges and curling into rotor-eating eddies. Pilots learned to read treetops, cloud shadows, and the language of their instruments. They learned that horsepower is a bank account you never want to overdraw. They learned that a jungle thunderstorm can hide 1,000 illusions and that the surest cure for panic is checklists. Air America's workforce was a collage. Americans, Thais, Lao, Hmong, Taiwanese, Filipinos, mechanics who could keep a radio engine purring with patience and wire, cargo handlers who could lash fuel drums so tight the mountain couldn't shake them loose, radio operators fluent in static and code, administrators who made the books look ordinary, case officers who thought logistics was a weapon more reliable than rhetoric. The company had real headquarters and phantom offices, audited accounts and black budgets. Its uniforms were whatever fit and breathed. Its reward was a paycheck and a purpose. Its burial details were quiet. The geopolitical rhythm that drove the airline's missions came from 3 metronomes. First, the Cold War, which turned maps into chessboards and made narrow valleys in Laos significant in rooms paneled with walnut half a world away. Second, the Geneva Accords and other treaties, which forced war to wear a camouflage of legality. Third, the logic of insurgency, which demands mobility, supplies, and morale, and punishes anyone who cannot improvise. Air power was how the United States stitched together a strategy that would have unraveled on the ground. When the U.S. could not send divisions into Laos, it sent aircraft that were not supposed to be there. When it could not acknowledge a base, it named it with numbers and told the world it was a weather station. Air America was the hinge between what could be said and what had to be done. There were set-piece moments. In 1968, as the war heated and the CIA's Hmong forces bent under pressure, Air America flew refugees out of valleys that turned overnight into kill zones. An airplane would land in a village with a line of people and take as many as weight and conscience allowed, then turn around because the line did not get shorter. Fuel calculations became moral arithmetic. A pilot who added one more person took off with margins thinner than the air he breathed. In 1971, as cross-border operations rippled toward the Ho Chi Minh Trail, sorties multiplied, and the airline schedule expanded to fill every dawn and dusk. In April 1975, when the rooflines of Saigon were black with people and the streets shrank under the weight of stories that would take decades to tell, Air America helicopters lifted from apartment buildings and embassy grounds, ferrying the last of a generation to ships that waited like exclamation points offshore. A famous photograph of a Huey perched atop a square roof with a radio mast shows an Air America bird loading evacuees. Many people think the picture is the embassy. It wasn't, but the confusion fits the times. In the end, everyone was where they weren't supposed to be, doing exactly what necessity required. The company's culture combined gallows humor with method. They named airstrips with a mix of numbers and nicknames. They kept a no-stripes etiquette. The best argument was the one that got everyone home. They traded hacks, the right flap setting for that one strip at dawn, the trick for getting a porter to pivot on its tailwheel in a wind, like recipes. They told new hires what not to do. Don't fly down a valley you haven't flown up. Don't trust a strip someone else called easy. Don't mistake a quiet radio for a quiet battlefield. Don't negotiate with the laws of physics. They kept a wall for photographs of airplanes and friends they had lost. The pictures faded, the memories didn't. Critics of the entire enterprise ask whether it worked. Did an airline, however brave its crews, change the shape of a war that ground strategy into dust? The answer depends on what you measure. In the short term, Air America delivered a logistics miracle. Villages supplied, units moved, wounded rescued, intelligence collected, lives saved. In the medium term, it sustained a clandestine army that bled the enemy and gave the United States another instrument for leverage in talks and operations. In the long term, the geopolitical arc bent toward the end we know. The Pathet Lao took power in Laos, Saigon fell, and the war ended not with a victory parade, but with an exodus. Air America could not alter the political gravity of a region where nationalism, ideology, and memory collided. It could, and did buy time, for families to escape, for negotiations to ripen, for one more bridge to be crossed before the river rose. What remains then is the human ledger. The pilot who learned to pronounce Hmong names correctly and understood that respect is a kind of air. The Lao loader who slept under a wing with earplugs made of cigarette filters. The mechanic who pulled a cylinder head at midnight by flashlight in faith because a helicopter had to fly at dawn. The case officer who discovered that the most important weapon in his kit was a credit slip at a hidden airline. The villager who waved at the departing airplane and hoped it would come back. The child who clutched the rice sack as if it were a book of spells. The war sank into history, but the people did not disappear into footnotes. They carried their lives forward, as people always do, across borders both visible and bureaucratic. After the final evacuations, after the last invoice was filed and the last rumor published, Air America wound down. The corporate shell exhaled one more time, and the planes were sold or transferred, their skin repainted, their histories disguised, their logbooks closing like novels. The pilots drifted to other airlines, other continents, other choices. Some kept flying, others quit the sky like a bad habit and a good friend. A few wrote memoirs in which fog lifts over mountains and the past looks as far away as it felt at the time. Their readers argued in letters to the editor and online forums about the fine points, which Lima Site had the worst downdraft, whether a certain load could really have been kicked, who flew the rooftop extraction in Saigon on that particular afternoon. Memory is another kind of politics. The legacy is complicated but legible. Air America proved that logistics is a form of strategy, that culture can be moved by propeller and rotor, that the space between war and peace is not a void but a crowded air corridor. It showed what happens when a great power outsources its nerve endings to a company with a quiet sign and a loud mission. It left behind a cautionary map, where secrecy intersects with necessity, competence must be absolute and accountability must not be erased. It also left behind proof that courage thrives in bureaucracy's shadow, that men and women will risk their lives for strangers because someone asked and because someone had to. Imagine one last flight. The sun is low, the hills are purple, the runway at Long Tieng looks like a ribbon tossed across a table. The pilot lines up, checks engine instruments, hears the familiar rattle in the headset that means the radio is alive, the world is listening, and no one will admit it. The airplane rolls, the tail lifts, the wheels pat the earth a final time, and the ground falls away, taking with it the noise of trucks, the smell of diesel, the faces on the edge of the strip. In the cabin, the cargo is strapped and anonymous. The pilot banks toward a notch in a ridge and watches the altimeter climb, numbers turning with the grace of a watch. He has flown this route 100 times. He knows where the clouds rise from the river like silk, and where the wind talks to the trees in a language of shivers. He knows that below him, on a terraced hillside, a woman is cooking rice, a child is watching the sky, and a man is saying to his neighbor that the airplane has gone again. It will return. It always returns, until one day it will not, and the valley will change. Far away, in an office where the carpet mutes footsteps, someone signs a memo that closes a file. The ink dries. The line in the budget moves to another line. The war ends because wars do. The pilots tell stories in bars where the light never changes, and sometimes they fall silent because some stories are not for company. The airplanes age. The jungle takes its green back. The old airstrips become scars or gardens. A rusty sign in a language few outsiders read leans against a fence post, and the wind nudges it into a new angle. A boy finds a rivet in the dirt and shows it to his sister, and she says it looks like a seed. The secret of Air America was not that it existed. Secrets like that can be guessed. The secret was how ordinary it had to be to do what it did. Schedules and manifests, fuel bowsers and safety wire, thermoses and checklists, jokes on a loading dock, arguments about weather, a man on a radio saying, "Say again," and meaning, "I will act on your next word." The extraordinary rode on the back of the mundane, and the mundane had to be perfect. That is the lesson the airline leaves behind, that a hidden architecture of competence holds up the visible theater of policy, that the most heroic acts sometimes look like work, and that a painted tail number can be an alias, a promise, and a prayer. So the airplane goes on, in memory and film, in photographs that misunderstand their own angles, in memoirs that can't decide whether they're about adventure or consequence. Air America is a chapter in a longer book about what nations do when they cannot say what they are doing, about the people who agree to be the hands of a strategy that will not sign its name. It is about mountains and monsoons, about villages where the runway begins at the field where rice grows and ends at the cliff where the sky begins, about a war that was for many years a rumor and for many years after a wound. It is about pilots who could put a porter onto a patch of dirt that looked like a rumor, about helicopter crews who learned to hover on the edge of physics, about mechanics who believe that safety is a collection of small, stubborn decisions. If you listen carefully, you can still hear it. A radial engine somewhere above the tree line, hesitant at first and then confident, a rotor thwack that starts as a rumor and becomes a heartbeat. In the imagination, a white airplane with a blue stripe slips between clouds. In a museum, a photograph of a rooftop evacuation arrests a stranger, who leans closer to read the caption and learns the name of an airline that didn't sell tickets. In a village that soldiers and diplomats have long since forgotten, an elder remembers an afternoon when a helicopter settled like a hawk and lifted 2 children into the future. The elder says the name to a grandson who will pronounce it differently and look it up on a phone made in a country that once hosted refugees. The past curdles into history and then clarifies into story. Air America belongs there now, in the space where complicated things are told plainly, in the place where the extraordinary comes home as the ordinary work of human beings under pressure. And if a young pilot somewhere, training in a simulator that smells like plastic and ozone, asks what it felt like, the answer is not poetic. It felt like heat and noise and muscle memory. It felt like a checklist read under breath while sweat stung the eyes. It felt like the math of weight and balance and the geometry of ridgelines. It felt like hope taking off with a heavy payload and a short runway. It felt like fear, but useful fear, the kind that sharpens hands. It felt like landing uphill into a headwind that switched cross at the last second. It felt like lifting people into a cabin, like strapping them in with the same straps that held fuel drums yesterday. It felt like a job that mattered and a secret that chafed. It felt like flying. In the end, the airline was an answer to a question that policymakers asked and history answered differently. Could an invisible hand, reaching by air, shape the fate of places whose names are hard to pronounce from far away? For a time, yes. The hand delivered food, moved armies no one admitted existed, and caught people who fell. Then the hand withdrew, because hands do when the body chooses another gesture. The imprint remains, a web of stories, a handful of photographs, a map dotted with Lima Sites that have been folded into terraces and reeds, an archive of maintenance logs and coded memos, a generation of men and women who can still hear in their sleep the sound of engines spooling up at dawn. Air America was a secret airline. Its work is less secret now. Its meaning is still argued. But if you stand at an old strip at dusk and hold your breath, you can almost believe the wind knows the name, and that it carries it along the ridges and down into the valleys where, for a few unforgettable years, airplanes loaned their wings to a nation's intentions and a people's survival.